Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Hordes Dairyman monthly webinar series. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an editor for Hordes Dairyman magazine. I will serve as the host for today's show, which focuses on dairy's path to climate neutrality. While methane is a potent climate pollutant that we can and need to reduce, it warms our atmosphere differently than other gases because of its short lifespan. By rethinking methane, animal agriculture can be on the path to climate neutrality with scalable solutions and tools to fight global climate change. And that's what we'll be discussing today. Our sponsor for the webinar is Feedworks USA, the exclusive distributor of algalan ruminant, and we thank them for their support of this program. If you're listening to the presentation live, you have access to a PDF copy of the slides that can be printed. Just go to the handout section of the webinar, go to webinar control panel, click on that PDF link, and you can print those out for future reference or to take notes on today. Also, if you have any questions for our speaker, please type them into the questions section of that control panel, and we will address them following the presentation. Today, we welcome Dr. Frank Mitloehner to our webinar. Dr. Mitloehner is a professor and air quality specialist with cooperative extension in the Department of Animal Science at the University of California, Davis. In this role, he shares knowledge and research with students, scientists, farmers and ranchers, policymakers, and the public at large. Frank is also director of the Clarity and Leadership for Environmental Awareness and Research, or CLEAR Center, which I think he'll tell us just a little bit more about. Frank received a Master of Science degree in Animal Science and Agricultural Engineering from the University of Leipzig in Germany, and a doctoral degree in Animal Science from Texas Tech University. Frank was recruited by UC Davis back in 2002 to fill its first ever position focusing on the relationship between livestock and air quality. He remains very passionate about understanding and mitigating air emissions from livestock operations, as well as studying the implications of these emissions on the health of farm workers and neighboring communities. In addition, he is focusing on the food production challenge that will become a global issue as the world's population grows to nearly 10 billion by 2050. So Dr. Mitloehner, thank you so much for being a part of our webinar series, and we look forward to hearing your presentation, which is titled Dairy's Path to Climate Neutrality.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure. Always enjoy your journal so much, and you do great work. Yeah, I was asked to talk about dairy's path to climate neutrality, and it's a little provocative. Some people think that's not achievable. I differ. I think not just is it achievable, but I've seen places where that's already happening. And so, let's see. There we go. So here is my title. Rethinking methane is really something I think that is a very timely thing to do, because I think that the world is thinking about methane in a way that leaves out very important nuance. We see a lot of discussion today about livestock and climate. In the past, you remember, we had other topics around animal source foods, such as we shouldn't eat cholesterol. My father was told, don't eat any eggs, never eat bacon, and so on. It kills your heart. Later, they did studies and found the opposite to be true of diets not affecting blood cholesterol, but it's more a genetic thing. Now, I'm not an expert in that, but I can tell you that the same journal that was honing in on this topic then later wrote things such as this. And similar changes I observe in and around the climate sphere right now, where people in the past said, well, livestock are a problem in general, because particularly ruminant livestock produce a lot of methane. The more livestock you have, the more methane you have. I think now our understanding is shifting, because methane is a tricky beast, and you will see in a few minutes what I mean by that. But before I go there, I think we're all aware that animal agriculture is really under the gun in a big way. We see many news outlets reporting negatively, and it doesn't really matter what kind of news you consume, you see negative reporting. And I don't know if these people are intentionally negative or if they're just ill-informed. I always want to assume that people are well-meaning, but when you read what you read, oftentimes you're just not under the impression that that's happening. So while a lot of the reporting is, I think, ill-informed, I think that we have also been too quiet in animal agriculture and we have not told the story, and I think that needs to change. The CLEAR Center, CLEAR, at UC Davis that I'm directing is making a serious effort in changing the narrative, and I think that this is really important. The narrative that needs to be changed is not one of greenwashing, making things look better as they are, but a science-based effort that that we turn into something that is of use to our consumers as well as producers. I do think that farmers are changing the narrative. They're doing it on the field or in the field, but oftentimes not with the consumer because they don't really like to talk about what they do. But look at this aerial shot here of a California dairy, for example. You have about a 1,500 cow dairy, and people might think that's a normal dairy. And it is a pretty normal dairy, but if you look closer, you see now that there are things such as solar panels here on the one side, running the whole dairy off the grid. And then on the other side here, you see a covered lagoon where the animal manure goes to, taking the biogas of that dairy and making it into transportation fuels for semi-trucks and so forth. These things are happening, and there's not a lot of reporting on this, but they are happening and they are making a big difference. And I will show you throughout this presentation how and why. When it comes to greenhouse gases, first of all, what are greenhouse gases? These are gases such as CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. They are emitted through human activity, and once we do put them out, then they accumulate in our atmosphere. And they pretty much form a blanket over our atmosphere, retaining the heat that comes in from the sun in our atmosphere. It's like a blanket that these gases form, retaining that solar heat here close to us. And without this blanket of greenhouse gases, life on Earth would not be possible. It would be too cold. But because we have that blanket, we do retain solar heat here, and that's a good thing. The problem is the blanket is getting too thick because we are producing too many of these greenhouse gases. And these greenhouse gases differ with respect to the ability they have in warming the planet. On a per molecule basis, methane is 28 times more potent than CO2, and nitrous oxide is 265 times more potent than CO2. So in other words, it is true that methane is a potent greenhouse gas. In fact, I call it the fast and furious greenhouse gas. Why do I call it the fast and furious? Well, furious because of its potency, but fast because of another property it has, and that is the fact that methane is not just produced, but methane is also destroyed. And you see it on this slide here. This slide shows the global methane budget. On the left side, various sources of methane, such as fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste, biomass burning, and so on. And on the right side, you see that there are sinks for methane. So the first half bubble says there are 560 teragrams of methane produced. And on the right side, you see that there are 550 teragrams of methane destroyed. In other words, almost as much methane is produced as is destroyed. And that leaves the balance, which is about 10 teragrams. And that is a number much smaller, of course, but still a number we seek to further reduce. So it's important that the take-home message of this slide that methane is not just produced, but it's also destroyed. In other words, there is a removal of methane, and the lion's share of that removal is an atmospheric removal. It is a removal of methane in the atmosphere. Underneath it says, sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. And what that means is that if a methane molecule in the air sooner or later is confronted with another molecule called a hydroxyl radical, then this radical destroys methane. And that happens in general in about a decade. So after about a decade, methane is no longer there, it's gone. The same is not happening for the other greenhouse gases such as CO2 or nitrous oxide. They don't have atmospheric removals, but methane does. And that has a very significant impact on how it warms the planet. You see that on this slide here. what I just showed you, the fact that methane is not just produced but also destroyed, leads to it having a short lifespan of about a decade. And contrast that to CO2 with a lifespan of about 1,000 years and nitrous oxide of over 100 years, both of which are long-lived climate pollutants. Methane is not. Methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. So I will now go and explain the so-called biogenic carbon cycle. So just really quickly, you and I exhale CO2 right now, carbon dioxide, right? Why are we not considered a CO2 source, a carbon source, and a net emitter of carbon? We are not considered a net emitter of carbon, even though we're expelling CO2, because what we are expelling there right now was in the atmosphere before, because the plants that we ate had taken the carbon out of the air, and the plants had accumulated it, assimilated it, made it into starch and other things, and then we ate the plants, and now we're putting that carbon back out. Okay, so the reason why the CO2 that we are putting out right now is not considered is because it's a wash, because it's nothing other than the back end of the carbon that went into plants that we then ate, and then we are expelling that carbon again. Okay, so that's why we are not considered a net carbon source through respiration. Now let's take a look where the carbon that's expelled from cattle, the CH4, where that carbon that's C in the CH4, where that's coming from. Well, it all starts with photosynthesis, the process by which plants take sunlight, water, and a source of carbon. And the carbon they take from the atmosphere, CO2, atmospheric CO2, it's making it itself into the plants, and then the plants convert that carbon into two things: cellulose, which is the world's most abundant carbon, and the world's most abundant feedstock and biomass, and starch. So the carbon becomes cellulose and starch. Our bovine friends come along and eat the grass or other forages or other feedstocks, all of which are plant material, and then in their rumen they produce methane gas. That methane gas comes out during what's called enteric emissions. Is this carbon, however, that cows produce, is that carbon new and additional carbon added to the atmosphere? And does that then lead to new and additional warming to our planet? And the answer to that question is no, it's not new and additional. It is recycled. It used to be in the atmosphere in the form of CO2. Now it's in the atmosphere in the form of methane. And while it is methane, it is heat trapping, okay? And it is a greenhouse gas of concern. But if we have a constant cattle herd, then the amount of carbon these animals put out and the amount of carbon that's destroyed are roughly in balance. And that means, and that's important, a constant source of methane does not add additional warming to our planet. I repeat that. A constant source of methane, such as a constant cattle herd, will not add to increasing warming, but to constant warming. And that would be in compliance with the Paris Climate Accord, which says we shouldn't cause new additional warming. So a constant herd produces constant warming. Okay, that's really important. An increasing herd would cause increasing warming, but if we reduce methane, then we reduce warming. Okay, and that's what makes us a potential part of a climate solution. So where's this methane then going? It's destroyed after about a decade through a process called hydroxyl oxidation, and it goes back to where it came from, to CO2, atmospheric CO2. So the journey on the biogenic carbon cycle starts with atmospheric CO2, goes to carbohydrates, then goes into methane, and then goes back to atmospheric CO2. So this is a approximately decade-long cycle. Is that, however, similar or different from other greenhouse gases that stem from other sources? The number one being fossil fuel-derived carbon. And the answer to that question is the journey of that carbon is quite different. So I just told you what the biogenic carbon cycle looks like. On the fossil carbon side, we have oil, coal, and gas, which were plants and animals that lived, died, decayed, fossilized over hundreds of millions of years, accumulated in the ground. And over the last 70 years, we took about half of that carbon out of the ground, we burned it, and we added this ancient carbon to the atmosphere. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not a short-lived cycle. This is a one-way street from the ground up into the atmosphere. On the right side, you see the biogenic carbon cycle I just talked about, where CO2 goes into plants, some stays in the above ground, the majority goes into the below ground vegetation. And from there, that carbon goes into the soil because soil microbes take it on. And this process is referred to as soil carbon sequestration, the process by which plants take carbon out of the soil, and that carbon is then accumulating in the soil. About 1/3 of all human-caused carbon is stored in our soils. That is why healthy soils are so important to us in our fight against climate change. Now, our bovines come along, eat some of the above ground vegetation, convert some of that carbon to methane, but in 10 years, that methane is gone and going back to the atmospheric pool of carbon. Okay, so we have a one-way street of carbon from the ground up into the atmosphere. On the biogenic side, we have a relatively short-lived, cyclical going back and forth of that carbon. Not new additional carbon is added, but existing carbon is recycled. So when we think of greenhouse gases, I just showed you in one of the previous slides that we use this GWP 100 unit, okay? I go back really quickly here. This unit here, GWP 100, describes methane as being 28 times more potent than CO2. This global warming potential 100 is used to describe the impact, let's say, of the dairy sector, the beef sector, and other sectors on climate. And so all that's done is if you were to have a dairy with producing 10 tons of methane per year, then all that needs to be done is multiply the 10 tons your dairy produces times this factor, 28. And you arrive at 280 tons of CO2e, CO2 equivalent emissions. So all the other greenhouse gases are converted into CO2 equivalent emissions. And that's what GWP 100 does. This is kind of an important thing, okay? Now, I have been criticizing this for a long time because I've been saying, look, yes, methane is more potent. Yes, it's 28 times more potent, but methane is also short-lived. It doesn't stay in the atmosphere for very long. So we can't just act as if methane were 28 times more potent when we know that gas is also destroyed. So we need to have something else that actually describes the impact of this gas on warming. And colleagues of mine from Oxford University agreed with the criticism of this GWP 100. They did the math and they found that if you were to use this old unit GWP 100, simply saying methane is 28 times more potent than CO2, if you use this GWP 100 for a constant source, let's say a constant herd of cattle, then you are exaggerating its impact by a factor of 4. I repeat that. If you use this old unit GWP 100, came first out in 1990, if you use GWP 100 for a constant source of methane, let's say a constant cattle herd, then you're overblowing the impact of that cattle source on warming by a factor of 4. Okay? It does not account for what happens when you increase, particularly not when you decrease methane with respect to its warming impact. And so out came a new unit, a new matrix that those colleagues at Oxford developed called GWP star. And this GWP star actually looks at the impact of methane on warming. And that's what it's really all about. That's why we care about greenhouse gases, because they have an impact on warming. And it does account for the short lifespan of this gas and the fact that it's atmospherically removed. Okay, I will now show you what this old unit GWP 100 looks like versus the new unit GWP star when you go through 3 different scenarios. So, okay, no, sorry, I have to back up. So first of all, this first bullet point that I made here, to my great joy, was reflected in the most recent Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC report that came out last August. This report, which is depicted on this slide here, has a section that says, and I quote, expressing methane emissions as CO2 equivalent emissions using GWP 100 overstates the effect of constant methane emissions on global surface temperatures by a factor of 3 to 4. That's a quote of the IPCC AR6 report on page 123 for those of you who might want to check that out. So, and in this report, you see mentioning of GWP star all over the place. So GWP star has been appreciated by the IPCC as one way of using a matrix, a new matrix, for complex sources of greenhouse gases. Sources that don't just produce CO2, but also things such as methane and nitrous oxide. So I want to explain to you now why and how gases like CO2 and methane are different, why it's important for us to know about that. So imagine you were to live 20 miles away from work. And on day one, on Monday, you drive your car to work. And when doing so, you burn gas and you put CO2 into the atmosphere. On Tuesday, you drive again and you put new additional CO2 into the atmosphere, adding to the existing stock from the day before. On Wednesday, you drive again, and every time you do drive your car, you add new additional carbon to the existing stock from the day before, the week before, the year before, the decade before, in addition to what your parents and grandparents and so on put into the air. This gas stays in the air for 1,000 years. It's cumulative, and this is what its trajectory looks like. It goes up, 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 and up. Every time we burn fossil fuel, we add new additional CO2 to the atmosphere. It is a stock gas as a result. And currently, methane is treated by most agencies as if it were stock gas too, as if every time our cows belch or their manure produces methane, it were to accumulate and be additive to what these animals put out the day before and the week before and the year and the decade before. But is that true? No, it's not, because methane is not a stock gas. It doesn't accumulate. Methane is a flow gas. It's both produced and destroyed. If you were to have a constant herd of cattle, let's say you've had 100 head cattle herd for the last 20 years, then your cattle have not added any additional carbon to the atmosphere. A flow gas looks like that. A constant source generates constant warming, no additional warming, okay? That makes a lot of a difference, as you can imagine, whether your gas is a stock gas and it accumulates, or it's a flow gas and it doesn't accumulate, okay? So remember, methane has an atmospheric removal, and that changes the way that this gas warms the planet. This slide here will show how GWP 100 and GWP star compare. There are three scenarios. The first one is one where methane over 30 years, you see it on the x-axis here, over 30 years increases by 35%. Second one is one where methane slightly decreases over 30 years. And the third one is one where methane is strongly decreased by 35%. So how would these three scenarios, the increasing, the stable, and the decreasing scenario, compare to one another using this old unit GWP 100? GWP 100 would say that in all three scenarios, we would add a lot of additional CO2 equivalent emissions to our atmosphere. And we know that can't be true, because methane is not just produced, it's also destroyed. So it cannot be true that when you have it going down slightly or going down by a lot, that we're adding a lot of additional greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, which causes additional warming. That's not physically possible. And because of this, this new unit from Oxford, GWP star, looks at the rate of change of this gas over time. Does it go up over time? Does it go down over time? Or is it stable over time? That's what this unit looks at. And what they found, these colleagues from Oxford, is this, that yes, if you increase methane by a lot, then you increase warming. And that's the blue north of the x-axis. We don't want to see that. In parts of the developing worlds, we do see that. In fact, even in the United States, we have a slight increase of methane because of an increasing number of anaerobic lagoons on dairies, okay? Anaerobic lagoons increase methane versus dry manure storage. And so we've seen some of that. Not much, but we've seen a little bit of that. In many other parts of the world and their respective dairy sectors, we see that methane is slightly going down. In some regions, methane is even going down by a lot. So that would be the second scenario here, where methane is not increasing, but kept stable or even being slightly reduced. And when you do that, then you don't see any blue north of the x-axis because an equal or greater amount of methane is destroyed versus produced. And that means now you see, because there's a 10% reduction of methane over 30 years here, you see a negative sign in front of the number. And that means there's now negative warming happening. When you reduce methane, you reduce warming. Remember that. When you reduce methane, you reduce warming. And if you manage to reduce methane by a lot, like you do in the bottom scenario, then you're pulling a lot of carbon from the air, much as if you were to, let's say, plant trees. Okay, planting trees means that you are reducing carbon from the atmosphere. When we reduce methane on dairies, we do the same thing. So what this really leads to is that if you have a methane reduction of 30, 35, 40% or so, then you're pulling so much carbon from the atmosphere that you're reducing warming on the methane side. And that reduction of methane on the methane side, that reduction of methane leads to negative warming, and that negative warming will offset other greenhouse gases, such as nitrous oxide, CO2. So much so that if you reduce methane by enough, that you reach a point of climate neutrality. So the reductions of warming on the one side offset other warming impacts of the dairy on the other side, and that leads us at some point to a situation where you reach climate neutrality. And that is the point where you don't add any more additional warming to our planet. Climate neutrality. That's depicted on this slide here for US dairy in blue and beef in orange. And then so on the y-axis here, you see the CO2 warming equivalent emissions. If you reduce methane by a lot, between 80 to 32% for the beef and dairy sector respectively, then you pull so much carbon from the atmosphere that at some point you reach the x-axis, and then once you cross the x-axis, you get into negative warming, meaning now you're net pulling carbon from the atmosphere. And that means you're now generating negative warming, and that's a fancy word for cooling. At that point here, and this is not a point that you reach with business as usual, but you reach it with covering your lagoon, using feed additives, and so on. When you reach these strong reductions, you get to a point of climate neutrality. And then you can actually sell your credits to other industries. And that is very lucrative. It's already happening in parts of the country. The one I live here, California, is one of them. We have put in place a lot of covered lagoons here in the state, and you might have heard about this, and I'll get to that in just a minute. Before I go to the California picture, just the overall dairy picture in the United States, you know that we used to have way more dairy cows historically than we do today. We used to have 25 million, today we have 9 million dairy cows. But with this much smaller herd, with the 9, we are now producing 60% more milk. That is really astounding. The carbon footprint of a glass of milk in the United States has shrunk by 2/3 over the last 70 years. This, ladies and gentlemen, is something that we could achieve in other parts of the world. Without shifting the blame, it is true that about 80% of global livestock emissions occur in developing countries. 80%. 20% in developed countries like the United States and Europe, but 80% in developing countries. And that's largely a function of inefficient livestock, inefficient reproductive rates, inefficient productive rates, and so forth. So in the United States, we're one of the role models in the world with respect to production efficiencies, as you can see on this one here. In California, we have a new law that mandates a 40% reduction, 40 that is, to be achieved by the year 2030. At first, our farmers thought, oh my gosh, just another law. What in the world are they doing to us? Little did our industry know at the time that this SB 1383 came out, that the legislature decided to use the carrot and not the cane approach. The carrot approach is one where reductions of methane will be and have been financially incentivized. Rather than you being penalized for producing methane, you are incentivized in order to reduce that gas. Dozens of our dairies, in fact, the number is anywhere between 150 to 200 dairies, have covered their lagoons, much like the one I'm showing on this picture, And by covering their lagoon, they are trapping the biogas. Approximately 60% of that biogas, 60, is methane, and methane is flammable. So methane is pretty much energy, okay? If you lose methane, you lose energy. If your cows belch methane, you lose energy. If your lagoon loses methane, you lose energy. So they're now covering that lagoon, they're trapping the biogas, and then the biogas is converted into a transportation fuel, referred to as renewable natural gas, RNG. This pathway from dairy biogas to transportation fuel is considered by the state of California as the most carbon negative fuel type there is, and that's a good thing. As a result, the state pays so-called low carbon fuel standard credits for this. The low carbon fuel standard credits generate a lot of income, and that's what makes this investment very lucrative to our dairy sector, and it's really taken off. I do think that within the next 5 years, half of our dairy manure in the state of California will end up being treated that way. And so you'll probably ask, well, how much of a reduction has that led to over the last 3-4 years with respect to methane? And the answer is we have reduced 30% of methane from California dairy's manure, 30%. So the goal is 40. We are already over halfway there, and that is nothing short of astounding. If you want to have a depiction as to what it looks like when you take dairy RNG, dairy renewable natural gas that stem from biogas, and make it into transportation fuels, well, here it is. These semi-trucks run off converted biogas, so to say, renewable natural gas, and now no longer use diesel. They now use this alternative. The state of California views this pathway very, very positively, okay? In the future, the dairy biogas will not exclusively go into RNG, renewable natural gas, but there will be another pathway called dairy biogas to EV, and EV is for electric vehicles. So we will electrify the vehicle fleet in the state within the next 10 or so years, at least when it comes to new vehicles. And many of the heavy trucks and so on will use this kind of fuel, RNG. So I do think that there's a very good future for those people who decide to go this route. But dairy lagoon conversion into covered lagoons and then conversion into RNG is one pathway. There are others. Other pathways of reducing methane include feed additives. Here you see some at UC Davis. We have done a lot of research, several dozen studies over the last few years using various feed additives to reduce enteric methane. That's the methane that's belched from the cows. Some of those additives shift the rumen microbial composition, and others disrupt the enzymatic production of methane. But while most of these additives are not commercially available yet, except for one, they will be available within the next 5 years. We have some hurdles to overcome, one of them being that none of those makers of feed additives is allowed to make a label claim of methane reduction. They can sell these additives saying that performance is enhanced, but not that methane is reduced. And that is some kind of an antiquated FDA rule that really needs to be addressed to the legislature, and I hope it will be. But my take-home message on this slide is there will be tools that will be added to the toolbox of our farms, and several of those will be cost-effective or even beneficial to the producer, because a reduction of methane is also a reduction of energy loss, and therefore can lead to better performance of cattle. Either better efficiency, feed efficiency, or better yield or components, or all. So we'll see. Research is very active and it's ongoing, but I'm bullish that this will be an important part, an important set of tools added to our toolbox. You might ask, well, who is paying for all of this? There are some states now that look into offset protocols for enteric emissions, meaning that there will be enumerations just like there is with biogas, also with additives in the future in certain localities like California. And then there are also large companies like Nestle, Starbucks, and so on, who already buy feed additives to be fed to dairy cows so that the farmers reduce their footprint, and as a result, the Nestle's and Starbucks reduce theirs because they are ultimately the ones selling the stuff. So, improved reproduction, improved animal health, improved genetics of feed crops and animals, and the feeding of more energy-dense diets. Those are the main four pillars of minimizing the environmental footprint of livestock. And add to that now feed additives, add to that now things such as digesters. We will drastically decrease the amount of not just greenhouse gases, but also other environmental pollutants in the years to come. I am very optimistic that not just climate neutrality is within reach, particularly when you reduce methane, but that we can reduce and drastically so the environmental footprint of dairy in the years to come, partly through improvements of performance, but also partly through a reduction of the loss of something that's very energy rich, such as methane. I sometimes get asked, well, why don't we just simply consume less animal source foods and therefore circumvent the need to reduce emissions on farms? Well, I'm very skeptical about that, but studied the literature in order to really get a better feel for what food habit changes would do to our climate. One study looked at what happens if you as an omnivore were to go vegan for 1 year. That would lead to a 0.8 ton reduction of greenhouse gases. So if you as an individual were to go vegan for 1 year, that will reduce your carbon footprint by 0.8 tons. Is that a lot or not? Recently I flew to Europe, and that one flight per passenger, transatlantic, led to 1.6 tons greenhouse gas production. So per passenger, 1.6 tons. That means to offset that one transatlantic flight that I did, I would have to go vegan for 2 years. I guarantee you that's not going to happen, but I'm just telling you, this is the amount we're talking about here. If the entire country in the United States were to go meatless Monday, some people toot that that would be wonderful. For example, in New York State, they do. If the entire country were to go meatless Monday, we would reduce 0.3% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And if the entire country were to go vegan altogether, no more dairy, no more meat, no more eggs, we would reduce the carbon footprint of the United States by 2.6%. Now, to me, that is very obviously not a gold standard to follow, not just because the emission reductions would be low, but also because 85% of the people who take such radical action, for example, to become vegan, to save the planet, will only do so for 1 year. 85% of all vegetarians and vegans stay that way for only 1 year and then revert back to omnivore, to being an omnivore. So to me, it is very clear that if we want to reduce the carbon footprint of food in all its forms, then we need to work with farmers, and the way that we do so effectively is by incentivizing emission reductions, because that is something that people can really rally around. So if you're interested in what the most important environmental part of our food system is, it's depicted on this side here. What you see is an average US family in front of all the food waste associated with them. And so it's about 40% of the food that we produce in this country that goes to waste. 40% of all the food we produce in all developed, and 40% of all the food produced in all developing countries never makes it through a human digestive tract. That is a true travesty and something that needs to change. And I think anyone can rally around that. By the way, the food items that are wasted the most are the perishable foods, and that's fruits and vegetables. About 60% of those are wasted, and 10 to 20% of animal source foods. A number that's better, the 10 to 20%, but still too high. I think we can all agree that we can do better. So with that, I come to a close, and just want to point out that some of the climate neutrality work I discussed today can be found in a white paper that Sarah Place and I wrote and put put out onto the Clear Center webpage. You find it at clear.ucdavis.edu, and there it's on the landing page. And we also put out a YouTube video called Rethinking Methane, depicting in 5 minutes why methane is so different and why it matters for us to know about that. So I said at the onset of this talk that I think that methane is a fast and furious greenhouse gas. And I told you that I think that we need to not de-emphasize, but emphasize its importance. But we need to stop thinking of it as a problem. And we need to start thinking of methane as an opportunity. One opportunity that becomes an asset when we manage it right. When we reduce enteric losses, when we reduce manure losses, we save money and we do the right thing for the environment. And with that, here's my blog, clear.ucdavis.edu/blog. Lots of stuff, interesting stuff on there on all different kinds of issues around sustainability. And my Twitter is here, GHGGuru, and the center that I'm directing is at UC Davis Clear. So please follow us if you're on Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, you should be on Twitter. Okay, with that, thank you very, very much for your attention. And I'm now very happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mitloehner, for that presentation. I know this is an area that you have studied extensively and speak on all over the world. So we're really thankful that you were able to join us and speak to our audience on this topic of climate neutrality, especially during this June Dairy Month, where we are all celebrating dairy producers and the products that really feed the world, and finding ways to do our part to be more environmentally friendly while still efficient in our production. So thank you for addressing this topic this month. I would also like to once again thank Feedworks USA for sponsoring this webinar. We really appreciate their support. And if you want to learn a little bit more about their products, you can find that in the handout that you can download, and there's some information about the company there too. If you would like to view this webinar again or any of our past webinars, you can find them on our website, hordes.com/webinars, and we have all of our archived webinars available there. Plus this one by Dr. Mitloehner will be posted later this week. So please check that out or share that with someone else if you think they would also benefit from this presentation. We hope that you'll make plans to attend some of our upcoming webinars. Again, our monthly webinars happen the second Monday of every month. In July, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Whitney Nauer from the University of Minnesota, and she'll be talking about housing options for calves. And then in August, we'll have a presentation by John Gazer from Rock River Laboratory, and he'll be focusing on strategies for silage harvesting success, as everyone across the country will be gearing up for corn silage time by that point in the year. So again, we hope that you will put these dates on the calendar and join us for a future webinar. Now, all attendees of the webinars receive an email about a week before the show asking if they have any questions, and we did receive a few questions beforehand. So Frank, we will go through those questions first. And this one came to us from Austria. Does the zero emission vehicle program in California work? Is it accepted, and will it continue? Any thoughts on that?
Zero emissions vehicle program. So as you know, I'm a livestock kind of guy, not a transportation guy. I do drive a zero emission vehicle myself, and the incentives are in place for people who have decided to drive a zero emission vehicle. They can get financial incentives, and they definitely are popular. We do have a very strong network of electric fueling stations all over the state, and so it's extremely convenient now to drive, and if you need to recharge, you recharge your vehicle in half an hour or so. So that is in full swing. It's continuing to happen. By, I want to say 2030 or maybe 2035, don't quote me on this, you will not be able to buy an internal combustion engine in California anymore. We will completely electrify all transportation, and I'm talking about normal passenger vehicles. The heavy-duty trucks will likely need other kind of fuels, such as hydrogen or RNG or so, but everything else will be electrified.
Thank you for weighing in on that question. And then if you go to the next slide, there you go. From France, we had this question come in. And actually, two questions here from them. What effect does cow size have on an animal's environmental impact? And then what are your thoughts on beef on dairy and how that affects total beef cow numbers and the role it plays in sustainability?
So in general, relatively smaller framed animals, let's say a Jersey versus a Holstein, is more efficient, and by being more efficient, she has a relatively smaller environmental footprint per unit of fat protein corrected milk. So there are breed differences. Other than that, I would say that large framed animals have a relative disadvantage in general, but to what extent, at what percentage, and so on, I cannot tell you. And the second question there, the beef on dairy is certainly something that's popular, to put beef semen into dairies, and it does have an impact on overall emissions. But I do not know to what extent. I know that there are colleagues now starting to study that, but I think while it's a hot topic, I have not really seen any numbers on that yet. But I would expect there to be an environmental footprint reduction for sure, because you just make better use of the offspring. And yeah, so that would have an impact on the environmental quality.
All right, thank you for addressing that question. Then if we will go on to the questions that came in during the presentation, we have a good group of them here, so an active audience today. First one is talking about feed additives. Are methane reductions from feed additives additive? So if you feed more than one, do you get the benefits of both?
So most feed additives have not been tested concurrently, okay? So I can't rule it out. But I cannot tell you how additive they are. So I would say if you feed, I said initially, there are two major kind of bins that additives are in. The one is the bin of additives that change microbial composition. So here I could see that there'd be combinations of feed additives that would be additive, but where I would definitely expect potential additives to occur is if you were to feed something that changes the microbial composition of the rumen, while at the same time affecting the enzymatic production of methane. That's the second bin. These two modes of action are different, really different. And so it might be that in that category we would find additive effects. So if you take the enzyme disruptors plus the rumen modifiers at the same time, then there could be additive effects. But this is a very active area of research, and most researchers still work on the individual effects of additives and making sure that if you reduce methane, let's say from belching, that this additive that affects that doesn't have any unwanted impacts, for example, on the manure of these animals. Believe it or not, that has been found that there are additives that reduce enteric methane, but they make it all the way through the manure, and then once you land incorporate that manure, they lead to more nitrous oxide, the other greenhouse gas, which is much more potent than methane. So we certainly don't want to see that, and while it's not very likely to happen with many additives, it has been found to be true for some. So we have to study these things more holistically and comprehensively.
Our next question, wondering if you have an opinion on genetic selection of animals for lowering their methane emissions and how that might be effective compared to using feed additives.
Well, genetics have gotten us to where we are today. Genetics are extremely important in optimizing the environmental performance of livestock, and they will continue to be extremely important. So I do think that genetic selection for low methane animals will be a thing. It is being researched. I met somebody in Switzerland the other day who makes that her main area of research. There are animals that produce just as much milk and same components in percentages and so on, but they produce a third less methane. Nobody really knows why, but they do. So there might be a genetic aspect of that, and if it were to be happening, then I'm certain that you will find that in the various genetic merit algorithms of the future.
This question is a more broad, big picture of climate neutrality and climate warming, if you will. How do we stop dairy from being used as the quick fix for methane reduction?
We don't stop them being viewed as the quick fix, because we are a quick fix. And that is seen as a problem by some, and it's seen as an opportunity by others. And I'm in the camp of people seeing it as an opportunity. When you reduce methane, you instantaneously have an impact on warming. Okay, that impact does not happen later; it happens instantaneously. So we have to position ourselves in a way that we say, look, we are a major methane source. We are not the major greenhouse gas source. In the United States, we make up about 2% of total greenhouse gases. Contrast that 80%, 80, being caused by fossil fuels. So we produce 2%. And the majority of the 2% of greenhouse gases from the dairy sector are caused by methane. So we know how much we produce, we know how much we can mitigate, and when we do mitigate, then that has a positive impact on climate. But even if we were to reduce all our methane, we would still just be a drop in the bucket, okay? But that does not mean to say that we mustn't do our share. We must. But we just have to make sure that the narrative is clearly understood by everybody, that this will not make or break us, okay, as to whether we reduce our methane by 20% or 50% will not make or break the warming contributions of the United States or anybody else.
All right, now we have two questions that focus on your section on food waste. One person would like to know where that 40% food waste number came from, where that data was from, and then is there a good way to really like understand or wrap our head around the effect that food waste has on our carbon footprint in general?
So first of all, where do the numbers come from? So many countries have the individual accounting. We have that through USDA. Globally, there's an accounting through the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO. The FAO has shared the numbers for North America, South America, Europe, for African countries, and so on. And I almost fell over when I saw that not just in the developed, but also in the developing countries, we have these massive numbers, but for different reasons. In developed countries such as the US, the majority of food waste occurs at the consumer level. That's in supermarkets, restaurants, our kitchens, okay? So that's where the avocado is too soft or too hard, we don't pick it. Or it's too ugly, it has a spot on it. Or the banana is too green, or it's too brown, or whatever it might be. Or the meat doesn't look red enough, it's a little pale, and so people just don't pick it. So these food items might be perfectly fine, but they are just not appealing to the consumer, we don't buy it. Or we buy package sizes that are too large and we can't make it through it. Or, and that's very important in the United States, we as consumers look at a food package and we look at the date on it, and it has expired, the date has expired, and we think that it's the expiration date, that it's no longer safe to eat. But it's not the expiration rate. In the United States, it's the sell-by date. The date that is on our food items expresses when this food item should have been sold and not when it should have been eaten. But people get it wrong, and as a result, throw things away. That's a big problem that needs to be addressed. In developing countries of the third world, the food losses don't occur at the consumer levels as much, but at the producer level. There, they can't harvest on time, transport the goods to distribution centers, and so on. And therefore, the losses occur earlier on during the life cycle of food. But globally, the number 40% is pretty robust, and it is untenable to me. The second part of your question, I forgot.
If there's just any maybe easy way to understand the impact that food waste has on our general carbon footprint.
Yeah, it is. I mean, think about all the resources that go into growing food, the fertilizer, the diesel, the equipment that you need in order to plow the fields and till, do whatever, spray and so on. Then the distribution centers, all the work at the processing centers and so on, getting all that stuff to the supermarkets, everything up until that point, all that has a significant environmental footprint, not just carbon footprint, environmental footprint, water footprint, air footprint, climate footprint, and so on. If we throw it away, which we do with 40%, and that stuff goes to the landfill, then it continues to emit there because there it generates methane. And it's just a terrible impact of that part of our food system on environmental quality. And we need to stop that. That's ridiculous.
Thank you for talking about that. Now we're going to go back to the cows, and this person says cows also produce carbon dioxide in the rumen. What is the ratio of carbon dioxide to methane that is produced?
The methane is way more important. I can't really tell you what the exact ratio is. I can't tell you that. It's a very anaerobic environment in there. And so you have a microbial environment that favors the methane generation. And so the CO2 in general does not really matter, neither from respiration nor from anything else in the cow. What matters is the methane, because the CO2 had always been considered a wash. But I told you a little story here earlier during my presentation that we are not considered an emission source because what we ate, the plants, had taken the CO2 out of the air. Then we are eating the plants and we are putting it back into the air. How is that different from what our cows do? How is that different from what our cows do? They are eating plants, and those plants had taken on CO2 from the atmosphere, and then the cows put the carbon back into the atmosphere in the form of methane, which is then converted back into CO2. There's one more extra step, which is the methane step. But as long as the methane stays stable, the same amount is destroyed that is also produced. So it's not really all that different.
Okay. Speaking of methane, how is methane emissions from cattle measured? Are there instruments, or what tools are used to measure that?
So it depends on who measures it. If it's someone like myself, then I can measure it. I can measure it in the lab just by having artificial rumen systems that just measure what happens in a rumen-like fermentation system. Then I can put cows into head chambers, and so you basically have the cow head in a see-through head box, and you measure all the gases that are inhaled, exhaled. You can also use an instrument that's like a stationary source into which cattle go, and when they put their head in there, a few alfalfa kibbles are dropped off, and therefore that entices the cow to go and stick its head in there. And while the head is in there, while she's eating those alfalfa pellets, the methane gets measured. And then I also have really large facilities. Well, some of them are garage size, just like your car garage size. You can put 3 cows in there. These are called environmental chambers. And then there are very large ones. And I have quite a few of those here at UC Davis, the so-called bovine bubbles. They're about 100 foot long, 40 foot wide, 30 foot tall. And you could put whole groups of cattle into those deals and then measure emissions from group housed animals. So we do research along those lines as well, particularly when it comes to studies that require FDA approval, Food and Drug Administration approval. The FDA wants to know what are emissions like under near real-time conditions and not just in a head box or so. And so that's when we do studies in these larger facilities. And you can use different kind of analyzers to measure methane. There are very different types of analyzers, and that would probably go too much into detail. But if you send me an email, I'd be happy to show you what analyzers are out there.
Thank you for addressing that. We've had a couple questions come in about differences between confinement operations versus pasture-fed cattle, both from the ration standpoint, and then the idea of that cattle that are grazing and their manure is applied directly to the field versus the process of producing, storing feed, and then hauling manure. Any comments in that area?
Yeah. In general, what generates methane, and as I said, methane is really the main greenhouse gas we are dealing with. What generates methane is largely the amount of roughage in the diet. The more roughage is in the diet, the more methane the animal will belch out. And obviously, under grazing conditions, the amount of roughage these animals produce is maximized. The efficiency of cows on pasture, the productivity is lower, and so the animals eat a feedstock that lends itself to maximum methane generation on the one hand, but the cows produce less milk, and so that puts them at a relative disadvantage over animals that are fed a TMR, a total mixed ration, under confined conditions. But there's something else that tips the balance, and that is an area that's hotly debated. The area is soil carbon sequestration and how much of that happens when you have animals grazing. So the animals excreting on pasture will deposit their manure. The manure will be entrenched in the soil. These additional nutrients added through the manure will enhance microbial activity in the soil, enhancing then soil carbon sequestration. At what rate and what the dynamics will be like over time has yet to be determined across different vegetation zones and climate zones in a country like the United States. In some areas, carbon sequestration increases first sharply and then tapers off and then no longer increases. In other areas, it increases continuously for a longer time. So that has yet to be seen. But in general, efficiency of production is what drives emissions, and dry matter intake on the one and roughage content on the other is what drives emissions, particularly of methane.
Thank you for that. Another question here. Do you have any comments on the implications that climate neutrality measures could have on herd health or safety?
I cannot think of a link between climate neutrality and reaching climate neutrality on the one hand and herd health, safety, or welfare. Because we are not saying do anything drastically different. I mean, just manage the methane properly from the manure and minimize it from enteric. So what I'm not promoting and never would promote is to get to a 0% methane from enteric. I don't think you can do that. You can reduce enteric methane by something like 30 to 40% without affecting anything else, in any negative way. There are some feed additives that if you feed them at high dose, very high dose, you can reduce enteric methane by 80%, 80. But at that point, you will have issues with animal productivity, with animal health. And the reason is that you still need to get rid of the hydrogen in the rumen, okay? And if you have a very high reduction of enteric methane, then you will have a buildup of hydrogen in the rumen, and that might have a detrimental impact on animal health and well-being.
Okay. This question is talking about a new technology of an in-plant inoculant that has been shown to reduce methane. These microbes survive in the rumen and live there and help reduce methane production. Are you familiar with this or have any comments about this technology? Sounds like it's pretty new. So
no, I've never heard of it. No. But there are lots of interesting new things out there. So what we know is that the additives, no matter what the additive is, they all have active ingredients. And the question will always be, how do we get active ingredients into animals, for example, under grazing conditions, where you don't have access to those cows all the time? Especially a big topic under or in the beef sector. Okay, how do we get feed additives into the beef supply chain, where the vast majority of emissions don't stem from feedlots, where the animals are finished, but from the cow-calf operation? And here's some thought is putting active ingredients into a bolus and then lodging that bolus in the rumen so that it slowly disperses the active ingredient. There's also some research in New Zealand on vaccines against methane. How far they have come, I don't know, but they're working on that. So there are new technology approaches that are being investigated.
So definitely an active area of research right now. This is a little more of, again, of an overview question, but saying if you have two cows, one produces 7,000 kilograms of milk, one produces 14,000 kilograms, is methane production driven more by total milk output or by the number of cows that are producing milk?
By the number of cows. If you always have to consider the maintenance requirements of cows, and so they always exist. So I'll give you one example. You need 10 to 20 times the number of cows in India to produce the same amount of milk as with one cow here in California. 10 to 20 times the number of cows over there. And the reason is that their milk production is dismal. Very, very low. We on average produce 23,000 pounds. They, on most dairies there, 1,000, 2,000 pounds per cow per year. And so you can imagine what the difference in environmental footprint is between those extreme differences. And of course, many countries in the world are much better than India is, let's say Mexico or so, but they still lag far behind, and as a result have herds that are much larger than they would have to be if cows were more efficient. So I'm not saying go to those places in the world such as India and have a US style system implanted. But what I am saying is producing 1,000 pounds of milk per cow per year is crazy. Okay, this is really not a good use of resources. And then to decide after the animal stops lactating to just cut her loose, and therefore then have tens of millions of animals walking around aimlessly without producing milk, that is a huge environmental footprint that gives us a black eye globally.
Very good. Now, switching gears to our last question here, kind of a two-parter, but would you say that the main way to reduce methane production is to improve manure management? And then is there a difference between like flush manure system and the scrape manure system in terms of methane release? Any comments there?
Yeah, I will first answer the second part. There's a big difference between liquid versus solid manure storage treatment. The liquid manure storage produces way more methane because methane is generated under anaerobic conditions. And if you have a lagoon, then you have anaerobic conditions that lend themselves for maximum methane production. So if you just have an open lagoon, then you produce more methane with that open lagoon as if you were to have solid storage. However, you can do things with an open lagoon. As I said, you could cover it, you can harness that methane and then sell it into the California market, get credits for it. But if it's just open, then you will generate quite a bit of methane. In fact, in the United States, I found that kind of a little upsetting because I thought looking at the production numbers, they all looked so great that it was very clear to me that the methane must have gone down in the United States over the last few decades. To then learn, though, that the methane actually has gone up. And the reason why it has gone up is because an increasing number of dairies has moved into liquid manure storage in lagoons. That is why it has gone up. So that's a trend that we need to be very careful with and that we need to keep an eye on, because we don't want methane to go up. We want it to be stable or preferably go down?
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Mitloehner, for addressing all those questions. And thank you to our active audience participants who came up with some great questions and thoughts to share. And we also had a couple of positive comments about the presentation, Frank. So thank you for delivering the information that you did. Once again, I want to thank Feedworks USA, who is the exclusive distributor of Agolan Ruminant, for their support of this webinar. And I also want to welcome you to our future webinars. If you can click ahead one slide, just want to remind you that in July, we'll be talking about housing options for calves. And that webinar will be sponsored by Agriplastics. And then in August, we'll have a presentation on corn silage harvesting and steps for success. So please mark your calendars, and we hope that you will join us for a future presentation. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Mitloehner for the information shared on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Obviously, this is a very current topic, and we are really happy to have you share your thoughts with our audience. Also would like to extend a thank you to my teammates, Patty Hirchin and Michaela King, for all their work on the production side of the webinar. And last but not least, I want to thank all of our listeners who joined us today. We are thankful you take time out of your busy schedules to be a part of our webinar. So once again, thank you. Until next time, goodbye from all of us here at Hordes Dairymen, and we hope to see you on a future presentation.